Awesome, great. So my project is called Form Follows Future, Epistemologies of the New Brown Vortex, and I'm Mateo Hurtado, and this is my senior research project. That is also a mouthful, so I'm going to call it an SRP for today. Yes, and great. So now, before I move forward into my introduction, I just want to clarify that the two main disciplines of this project, which are also my majors, are theater studies and Latino studies. Yes, so introduction. Great, so in addition to the disciplines, I also have one other key term that's really vital to the scope of this project and really what got me interested in studying and using these two fields with my research. So this term is futurism. So what I mean by that is I'm looking specifically at the futurist school of thought, and the futurists were experimental artists who were predominant in the beginning of the 20th century and very much about like experimental work and being exploring differences between audience and performance in terms of space, in terms of visuals, so very intense, very visceral, very avant-garde. So that school of thought and those ideas were something that really interested me in terms of which plays I thought were important to research and analyze for my archive, which I'll get to in a little bit. So, and then also some keynotes that really delve into why futurism is that futurism is also something that's connected to anti-structure, anti-institution, but on the other side they're also pro-technology, and they're you know very they're all about moving forward in that sense. So those are some ideas that really were something that I was able to tap into later in the project. Great. So more specifically with the scope of this project, the first part of it is that it's a literary archive. So what I did was I analyzed plays from the 1960s up until now. And mainly why I decided to look at the 1960s is because this is the rise of the intersection between aesthetics, politics, and brown resistance, but specifically through performance. So while in the 1960s we see the Black Panthers, and then that echoes into the next decade with the Young Lords, and then that goes over into the Chicana Brown Berets, what we also see is a rise in experimental theater and the rise of production of these plays, but also, you know, what was ripe to investigate is the style and how these writers were experimenting with form and language and also different staging techniques. So that was really what caught my interest, and really that's where the stakes were. You know, I was like, this is where we need to start instead of going from, you know, 10 years ago to now, because there's so much that's informing the scope of these playwrights' trajectories and their careers and their influences. So I immediately had to turn to the 60s as my reference point that I mapped out and looked at from then until now. And the second part of my project is, was staging. So what I did was I made sure to thoroughly look at which plays really represented or reflected some core ideas and stylistic choices from each decade. And what I did was I picked one scene per decade, and then I was like, well, you know, in order to get a sense not only of the experimental language on the page, I needed to put it on the stage. I needed to get it on its feet. I needed to work thoroughly and see, you know, these changes, but, you know, performed, because I really thought about how while we think of literature and poetry that, you know, pretty much does pretty fine just on the page, I was like, no, this needs to be staged. We need to see the connections that that these scenes might have with each other thematically. So it's, you know, connecting back to, you know, and then also for me, what I want to explain is the New Brown Vortex. So what is the New Brown Vortex? So for me, the New Brown Vortex is two different things. The first being a way of understanding time. So I thought about it, I was like, what can I use as a framework? What can I use as a visual to really think about time in a non-linear sense, to really remove this idea of just going from you know, defunct or ugly or messed up and then going to progressive and excellent, you know. So instead of thinking it like that, instead with the vortex we get this sense of repetition, we get things happening in waves and different, but also in a very fast pace. So That's one way that I think of the New Brown Vortex. And then the second way that I construct the New Brown Vortex is also a literary canon of plays by these experimental playwrights. So it's like a collection. It's like the collection that I'm presenting and offering to theater studies of the ones that I deem as experimental in form and language from the 60s to right now. So that's pretty much how I was able to mess with that. Great, and then going back to the staging part, which I have pictures from, because that's always a good thing. Pictures are super great. I want to delve into staging a timeline. So for me, what the next step was to really think about if these plays are so experimental and so out there. Also, I need to add the conceptual and make sure that the staging of it is also experimental. So what I ended up doing was I staged it right in this room, like to be super, like I staged it right here because from a theoretical standpoint, it was essential to stage it in Latino studies, literally and, theoretically, but then also, I had to work within the confines of what we got from this space. So what I added to it was the genre of environmental theater. And the only way that environmental theater works is to have the audience moving and moving and moving and really just like having no traditional seating. And that also blends this idea of, or this separation of audience and performers. So when it was staged here, some of y'all were in the room, were at this performance, very much noticed that as we traveled through the decades, we needed to look at space in different ways and also use the parts of the room to our advantage. So this particular picture happened of this performance is right in that corner of the room, and that is from Giving Up the Ghost by Sherry Moraga. So what was interesting is that the confines or the setup of the scene was that it took place in a bedroom with the two characters, Amalia and Marisa, and they're two queer Chicana women who are, in the bedroom together. And what was interesting is that the scene called for one of them painting and, drinking coffee and relaxing and sharing stories. But then we're like, well, we don't really have like paint or anything like that. So we really used everything in the space because in a really beautiful way, there was a huge mural in the background. So, it's very much like on the fly, connections that really did honor what the performance needed and what the space needed. So, so that was one way that we were able to make it work in that sense. And then something that I also want to, backtrack and really map out for y'all is that another dynamic is that I also had to serve as the narrator because I had to really think about my audience. And I'm like, well, if this is mainly people who go see shows with the Brown Theater Collective who are really not really exposed to theater or have a full context or are well read on different things, I needed to make sure that it's accessible and that we're walking decade by decade in a cohesive way, in an accessible way, in a fun way. So I served as the narrator and really set up the scenes and set up the vibes and the experiences from the decades. But on top of that, my excellent stage manager, Evan Duncan, who's pictured in that closet, because surprise, that's also a closet, he was a stage manager, and for y'all, a stage manager is pretty much someone who makes sure that everything is safe, makes sure that everything is running smoothly, so very detail oriented. So in addition to that, he also is well trained in playing the bass. So what he did was he provided a really beautiful soundscape for us as we traveled through these decades and made sure to play different songs. Like he played Prince, he played Jenny from the Block when we went to the 2000s. So there was so many different amazing vibes and experiences with that. So I think that was also imperative to really get a feel for, not only are we having blackouts and light changes and my monologues, but on top of that we also have sound as a constant while everything else is changing. So sound is something that we can fall back on, and also people might not have picked this up at first glance, but also the reoccurring themes of the scenes that were happening too, that just kind of appeared in different forms. So it was this notion of battle of the sexes, but also racial discrimination, but then also on top of that gender formation and identity. So all of them in really beautiful ways recycled and reoccurred and revamped themselves decade by decade. Yes. And then so by that, I really want to conclude with some final thoughts about some big takeaways from this project. So moving forward and backward and upside down, really what this project made me think about is that, you know, because under the umbrella of this project, I presented it to the Brown Theater Collective, which is a group that I started specifically because of the lack of attention on this campus, but also in the world we live in, to racial representation in the arts and specifically in performance. So I started this group basically like a year ago, and so since this performance was under the BTC, what I noticed is that this performance and this project serves as a citation for history. So it really brought to my attention, you know, working on this an entire year, that this kind of work is essential for theater studies and Latino studies because of the archival purposes, because of the documentation purposes about how we think about history and the real necessity for reimagining that and reconstructing that and reforming that. So, you know, that was one of my big takeaways from that. And then also, on another note, thinking about specifically in theater studies, it made me think about how right now we're expunged and removed from representation, not only on the stages, you know, as Latinos, but also in the classroom when we think about theater history. So, and then, you know, to finish things off, I want to think about how this genealogy is really represented by other paths that have already been created. So this is very much following work from the New Rican Poets Cafe, from Teatro Campesino, from the Puerto Rican Traveling Theater, and then also, you know, so it's like this Vortex is honoring that, removing it, reimagining it, twisting it, distorting it, and moving forward. So that is how I want to finish things off. And then, of course, wrap things up with, of course, thank yous are good. So for unwavering support and guidance, Professor Sandra Ruiz, who's my faculty mentor and has been here the entire step of the way. Shout out to the Department of LLS, Alicia, Laura, Professor J.W. Morissette, the BTC, and my friends and family. So thank you.
We have time for one question for Mateo.
Okay.
I'll just say quickly with your gracious thank you sequence, you're ready for the Academy Award.
I mean, they didn't have like the orchestra. I don't know how this is the orchestra, but they didn't cut me off. So you're right. I guess I am ready.
It's not a question, it's more a comment towards you and to Carla. Is that I hope you publish and get this information out. I think that one, you don't need a graduate degree, so whether you go to graduate school or not, the knowledge that you produce is essential and needed. So whatever your journeys are after this, I can't wait to see it in a different venue and for mass circulation. So
cool. Thank you. Thanks.